Summer 1943. Camp Crossville, Tennessee. The brown liquid fizzing in the bottle mesmerized the German soldier who had never seen anything like it. Hans Müller, a weathered Afrika Korps veteran, held the cold glass bottle with trembling hands, watching tiny bubbles dance to the surface like miniature explosions. After 2 years fighting in the scorching North African desert, subsisting on nothing but hard biscuits and bitter ersatz coffee made from roasted acorns, this sweet, carbonated drink called Coca-Cola represented impossibility made real. It cost 5 cents from the camp canteen, the same price, guards informed him with casual indifference, that American children paid with their weekly allowances. 5 cents. In Germany, 5 Pfennig wouldn't buy a crust of stale bread, yet here in this American prison camp, it purchased liquid joy that fizzed on his tongue and sent unfamiliar sweetness coursing through his war-ravaged body. Hans wasn't alone in his bewilderment. Across American prison camps that summer, 371,683 German prisoners of war would confront a reality that contradicted everything Nazi propaganda had taught them about American weakness and decadence. They discovered a nation where ice cream was a routine dessert, where soft drinks were everyday beverages, where candy bars were so common that guards gave them away like cigarettes. These simple foods, treats that most German children had never tasted even before the war, would systematically demolish Nazi ideology more effectively than any Allied propaganda program ever could. The mathematics of abundance were being written in sugar and carbonation, in chocolate and vanilla ice cream, revealing an American industrial capacity that rendered German wartime deprivation not a noble sacrifice for the fatherland, but simply needless suffering. What began as Hans's amazement at American confections would evolve into complete psychological transformation, not just for him, but for hundreds of thousands of German soldiers who would taste democracy and find it sweeter than they ever imagined possible. But how had they arrived at this moment of revelation? The desert's end came swiftly and brutally in May 1943. The Afrika Korps surrender in Tunisia brought approximately 250,000 German and Italian soldiers into Allied captivity, ending Rommel's legendary campaign across North Africa. These, instead, within hours of laying down their arms in the dusty Tunisian hills, they encountered something that defied every assumption they held about their enemies: American K-rations. Sergeant Klaus Weber, a tank commander who had survived 2 years of desert warfare, stared in disbelief at the olive-drab package placed in his hands by a young American soldier barely out of his teens. These field rations, which American GIs routinely complained about as bland and monotonous, contained treasures beyond imagination: crisp crackers that didn't crumble to dust, processed cheese that hadn't spoiled in the desert heat, candy bars with chocolate that actually melted on the tongue, fruit bars bursting with sweetness, instant coffee that produced a rich brown liquid when mixed with water, sugar tablets, and even cigarettes, real tobacco, not the sawdust mixture German soldiers had been smoking for months. German soldiers who had survived on minimal rations for the final months of the North African campaign treated these emergency meals as royal banquets. Hans Müller found himself crying as he bit into his first piece of American chocolate, the sweetness overwhelming taste buds that had forgotten such pleasure existed. Around him, other prisoners wept openly as they discovered that each K-ration contained enough food to sustain a man for an entire day, more calories than they had often seen in 3 days of German army rations. But the K-rations were merely the beginning of their education in American abundance. At the temporary processing camps hastily erected in the North African dust, the US Army served meals that seemed to mock the very concept of wartime rationing. According to meticulously kept military records, German prisoners received pancakes drowning in real maple syrup, fresh eggs cooked to order, glasses of cold milk that hadn't been watered down or rationed, and coffee served with both sugar and cream. Luxuries that had vanished from German military rations years earlier, even for officers. The systematic feeding of enemies with superior food began immediately, though its profound psychological impact would only be understood in the months to come. A German officer later testified to the International Red Cross. "We expected to be starved as prisoners, as we had been taught American soldiers were cruel and vindictive. Instead, the Americans fed us better than our own army had fed us in the final year of fighting." How could a nation at war, fighting on multiple continents simultaneously, afford to feed enemy prisoners better than Germany fed its own soldiers? The question haunted every German prisoner as they prepared for the journey across the Atlantic to an America they had been taught was weak, divided, and on the verge of collapse. They were about to discover just how wrong their propaganda had been. The Liberty ships carrying prisoners of war across the Atlantic in the summer of 1943 provided the most intensive education in American abundance that any German soldier had ever received. These vessels, mass-produced at unprecedented rates, with one completed every 42 hours at peak production, transported up to 30,000 prisoners monthly to the United States in a logistical operation that dwarfed anything the German Navy had ever attempted. Hans Müller stood at the rail of the USS General George Washington, watching the endless Atlantic horizon while trying to comprehend the ship beneath his feet. Built in American shipyards in less than 6 months, this floating city contained everything necessary to transport thousands of men across the ocean in relative comfort. But it was the food that continued to challenge every assumption he held about American society. Naval records meticulously documented that prisoner rations aboard these ships matched or exceeded standard crew provisions. Approximately 3,500 calories daily, including fresh bread baked in the ship's own bakery, meat served at every meal, vegetables that somehow remained crisp despite the ocean crossing, and coffee served with unlimited sugar and fresh milk. The ship's refrigeration systems, standard equipment on American vessels, maintained fresh food throughout the 2-week crossing, a technological feat that impressed even German engineers among the prisoners. But nothing could have prepared them for what happened on July 4, 1943. The USS General M.B. Stewart's log records that ice cream was served to prisoners on Independence Day, using the ship's ice cream maker that could produce 10 gallons per batch. Hans watched in stunned silence as American sailors cranked the mechanical freezer, adding ice, salt, cream, sugar, and vanilla extract, as if these precious ingredients were as common as seawater. For men who hadn't seen ice cream since before the war, if they had ever seen it at all, this frozen dessert served in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. We are enemies, yet they give us dessert as if we were honored guests. The American sailor serving the ice cream, a farm boy from Iowa named Tommy Patterson, shrugged with the casual indifference that would become familiar to every German prisoner. "It's the 4th of July, buddy. Everyone gets ice cream on the 4th of July. Even you guys." This democracy of dessert, the idea that national celebrations included even enemy prisoners, introduced concepts of American society that no German could have imagined. In Germany, special foods were reserved for party officials and military officers. Here, abundance seemed to flow downward rather than being hoarded at the top. When the ships finally docked at American ports like Norfolk and Newport News, German prisoners encountered an America that Nazi propaganda had declared impossible. The Norfolk Naval Base, covering 4,300 acres with extensive waterfront facilities, handled more cargo daily than major German ports managed in a week. Massive cranes moved freight with mechanical precision, while trucks lined up in endless convoys to transport goods across a continent. At the port exchanges, shops for dock workers and sailors, prisoners glimpsed shelves stocked with candy bars from major manufacturers like Hershey, Mars, and Nestlé. Military procurement records from 1943 show these exchanges stocked dozens of candy varieties, all selling at standard prices of 5 cents for most bars, the same price charged in small-town drugstores across America. The prisoners pressed against the windows of their transport buses, watching American civilians casually purchase multiple candy bars, soft drinks, and ice cream cones, without any apparent rationing restrictions. Children ran alongside the buses, holding bottles of Coca-Cola and waving at the German prisoners, with curious rather than hostile expressions. Hans Müller realized that everything he had been taught about American society was not merely wrong, it was the precise opposite of reality. America wasn't weak. It was so strong it could afford to waste resources. It wasn't divided. It was so unified that even children felt safe enough to wave at enemy prisoners. And it wasn't on the verge of collapse. It was producing abundance at levels that made German peacetime prosperity look like wartime rationing. The journey inland by train would provide even deeper education in the Camp Crossville, Tennessee, where Hans Müller found himself assigned, was typical of the larger facilities designed to exceed Geneva Convention requirements while utilizing prisoner labor for America's wartime economy. The camp itself defied every expectation German prisoners held about enemy treatment. Electric lights illuminated every barracks, hot water flowed from taps that had never run dry. Flush toilets and heated buildings provided comfort that many German soldiers hadn't experienced even in peacetime barracks. But it was the camp exchange, the PX store, that delivered the most profound psychological impact. According to meticulously maintained Army quartermaster records, the Camp Crossville exchange stocked an inventory that would have been impossible to imagine in wartime Germany. Multiple soft drink brands, including Coca-Cola, Pepsi-Cola, Dr. Pepper, and RC Cola. Various candy bars and confections from Hershey, Mars, Baby Ruth and Snickers. Ice cream bars and sandwiches when refrigeration permitted. Cigarettes and tobacco products, fresh fruit including apples, oranges and bananas, and even beer with 3.2% alcohol content for prisoners who had demonstrated good behavior. Prisoners earned 80 cents daily for their labor in camp workshops, farms and local industries, wages later raised to a full $1 per day. With candy bars priced at 5 cents and Coca-Cola at the same price, a single day's wage could purchase 16 items of abundance beyond German imagination. In Germany, such products, if available at all, required special connections, black market dealings, or party membership. Here, any prisoner with pocket change could walk into the exchange and purchase luxuries that German civilians could only dream about. Hans Müller's first visit to the camp exchange remained burned in his memory decades later. Shelves lined with identical bottles of Coca-Cola, each one guaranteed to taste exactly the same, whether consumed in Tennessee, California, or Maine. The standardization astounded technically minded prisoners. This feat of quality control exceeded anything German industry had achieved, even in peacetime. The Coca-Cola Company's wartime production had reached remarkable levels, with company records showing 5 billion bottles produced in 1943 alone, all meeting identical specifications despite being manufactured at bottling plants. This camp gets about 300 cases a week. That's, he paused to calculate, about 7,200 bottles just for you boys, and that's just one of maybe 1,000 camps getting regular deliveries. The mathematics was staggering. If Camp Crossville alone consumed over 7,000 bottles of Coca-Cola weekly, and similar camps operated across America, the total production numbers suggested an industrial capacity that dwarfed German achievements. The syrup concentrate manufactured in Atlanta and distributed nationwide to bottling plants represented industrial coordination that challenged fundamental Nazi assumptions about American chaos and inefficiency. But Coca-Cola was merely one element of the abundance. Ice cream in American prison camps seemed equally impossible to Germans who hadn't seen frozen desserts since before the war. Yet Army records confirmed that ice cream was regularly served in camps with adequate refrigeration during summer months. The military considered ice cream so essential for morale that specialized ships were built specifically to manufacture and deliver ice cream to troops in the Pacific Theater. At Camp Crossville, the July 4th celebration of 1943 included ice cream, made on site using hand-cranked freezers. German prisoners watched in fascination as American guards produced gallons of frozen dessert using ice, salt, cream, sugar, and flavorings. The casual use of scarce resources like ice in July, cream and sugar for entertainment food demonstrated priorities that Germans couldn't fathom. By 1944, many camps had acquired electric ice cream makers capable of producing industrial quantities. The variety available, chocolate, vanilla, strawberry, butter pecan, exceeded what German ice cream parlors had offered before the war. Prisoners could purchase ice cream bars for 10 cents, ice cream sandwiches for the same price, or cups of various flavors from the camp exchange. Otto Schneider, the former Luftwaffe pilot, found himself regularly purchasing ice cream, despite initial skepticism about frozen desserts. In Germany, we learned to consider such things frivolous luxuries that weakened fighting spirit. He wrote in a letter that passed camp censorship. Here I watch American soldiers eat ice cream and then perform military duties with discipline and efficiency. Perhaps we misunderstood the relationship between abundance and strength. The sugar consumption in American prisons. In American camps, sugar sat in bowls on mess hall tables for unlimited use. Quartermaster records from 1943 to 1945 show camps receiving 100-pound bags of refined sugar weekly, used liberally in camp bakeries to produce cakes, cookies, and pies that appeared regularly on prisoner menus. One documented incident from Camp Aliceville, Alabama, illustrated the cultural gulf perfectly. In August 1943, humid weather had hardened several 100 pounds of sugar, making it difficult to measure for cooking. Rather than steam and recover it, as Germans would have done with such precious commodity, kitchen staff simply discarded the hardened sugar and ordered replacement supplies. German prisoners working in the kitchen were reportedly distressed by this waste, unable to comprehend a society so abundant that ruined sugar could be casually thrown away. The democratic nature of this abundance proved equally challenging to German preconceptions. Unlike the rigid hierarchy of German society, where luxuries flowed upward to party officials and military officers, American abundance seemed to flow in all directions simultaneously. Prisoners observed that American guards ate the same food, drank the same soft drinks, and enjoyed the same ice cream as prisoners. Abundance was not a privilege to be earned through rank or political loyalty, but an assumed right of everyone within American society. This realization would prove more destructive to Nazi ideology than any propaganda campaign ever could. By late 1943, German prisoners of war had gained access to American publications, and the production statistics they discovered dwarfed German achievements so dramatically that many initially assumed the numbers were propaganda exaggerations. The mathematics of abundance told a story that completely undermined every assumption about American industrial capacity and German superiority. Hans Müller sat in the camp library at Crossville, staring at a copy of Fortune magazine that detailed 1943 American production figures. The numbers seemed impossible, yet they aligned perfectly with everything he had observed during his months in captivity. American sugar production had reached approximately 7 million tons annually, a number so vast that it explained the casual abundance he witnessed daily. In Germany, sugar was so scarce that ersatz sweeteners made from saccharin had replaced real sugar in most civilian applications. The Coca-Cola company. The standardization remained most impressive to German engineers among the prisoners. Every bottle of Coca-Cola tasted identical whether consumed in Maine or Texas, a feat of quality control that German industry had never achieved, even for basic products like bread or beer. American chocolate and cocoa product manufacturing reached £380 million for military consumption alone in 1943, not including massive civilian production by companies like Hershey, Mars, and Nestlé. German chocolate production had been reserved exclusively for military use since 1941, and even then remained insufficient to supply all troops. American prisoners received chocolate regularly, while German soldiers on the Eastern Front hadn't seen chocolate bars in over a year. But perhaps most staggering was American ice cream production. Over 500 million gallons annually, continuing throughout wartime when most European nations had eliminated such luxury foods entirely. The industrial infrastructure required to maintain ice cream production during global war, refrigerated transport, milk processing facilities, flavoring production, packaging systems, represented technological and logistical coordination beyond German comprehension. Otto Schneider, working at a local dairy farm through the camp labor program, witnessed American food production firsthand. The single farm where he worked processed more milk daily than entire German regions had produced during peacetime. Mechanical milking systems, refrigerated storage tanks, and automated bottling equipment produced thousands of gallons of fresh milk daily, much of it destined for ice cream production. "I counted the cows," Otto wrote in his journal. 236 Holstein dairy cows on this one farm. Before the war, my village in Bavaria had perhaps 50 cows total, and we considered ourselves prosperous dairy country. This American farmer produces more milk in a week than my entire district produced in a month. The quality control at American food processing facilities astounded German observers. At canneries where prisoners worked, approximately 15% of perfectly edible fruit was rejected for minor imperfections, size irregularities, slight blemishes or color variations that didn't affect taste, but failed to meet standardized appearance requirements. This rejected food, which would have been considered premium quality in Germany, was typically diverted to animal feed or compost. Single American farms produced more sugar beets than entire German regions, using mechanical harvesters, automated processing equipment, and transportation systems that moved millions of tons of raw materials with minimal human labor. Hans Müller, assigned to work at a sugar processing facility near Camp Trinidad in Colorado, watched in amazement as conveyor belts moved endless streams of sugar beets through cleaning, slicing, and extraction processes that operated 24 hours daily. The facility processed more sugar in a single day than his hometown in Germany had seen during the entire war. "The machines never stop," he wrote to his wife through the International Red Cross. "Day and night sugar pours from these factories like water from a spring. Now I understand why American prisoners put sugar in their coffee without measuring, why they bake cakes and cookies as if sugar costs nothing. Here, abundance is not rationed, because abundance is reality." By 1944, a remarkable reversal had occurred that definitively proved American abundance. German prisoners in America were sending food packages to Germany rather than receiving them. Using their camp wages, prisoners purchased American products to mail home: chocolate bars, instant coffee, canned goods, cigarettes, and even small luxuries like soap and candy. International Red Cross records confirm that German prisoners in America sent approximately 11 million parcels to Germany during their captivity, most containing food items unavailable in their homeland. The psychological impact on German families receiving American abundance from imprisoned relatives, while facing starvation in freedom, profoundly undermined Nazi ideology at its foundation. Children in bombed German cities received Hershey chocolate bars from fathers held in American prison camps, while German propaganda claimed American industrial collapse was imminent. American rationing, implemented to support the war effort, revealed the gulf between societies more clearly than production statistics ever could. Americans complained about sugar rationing that limited them to £2 monthly per person, more than triple the German civilian allowance when sugar was available at all. American meat rationing restricted families to 28 ounces weekly per person, exceeding what most Germans received monthly, even before wartime rationing began. Even rationed, Americans maintained consumption levels that Germans considered impossible. American children continued receiving school milk programs, candy remained available in most stores, and ice cream production continued at levels that supplied regular dessert to both military and civilian populations. The contrast became undeniable when German prisoners working outside camps observed American school lunch programs. Children received hot meals including meat, vegetables, milk, and often dessert, a level of nutrition that German children hadn't experienced since before the war. Some schools offered ice cream for additional purchase, creating the surreal image of American children buying frozen desserts at school, while German children faced systematic malnutrition. These observations would fundamentally reshape how returning prisoners understood the relationship between political systems and prosperity, setting the stage for post-war transformation that would define German-American relations for generations. Spring 1945 brought the war's end, and with it the final psychological blow to Nazi ideology. As American forces advanced through Germany, German prisoners of war in America watched newsreels of GIs distributing chocolate bars and chewing gum to German children. The joy on those children's faces as they received American candy, sweets their own government couldn't provide, completed the ideological demolition that had begun with that first bottle of Coca-Cola. Hans Müller stood in the recreation hall at Camp Crossville, watching grainy footage of American soldiers in his homeland, sharing rations with skeletal concentration camp survivors. These same American troops, advancing through enemy territory, carried enough surplus food to give away chocolate and gum to children whose parents had sent him to war, promising German victory and American weakness. The contrast couldn't have been starker. American soldiers advancing through enemy territory possessed such abundance that generosity toward victims and civilians was routine, while the German state that had promised thousand-year prosperity had delivered only starvation and destruction. The films of concentration camp liberations showed American troops sharing their rations with victims of the regime German soldiers had served, demonstrating humanity toward those the Nazi state had systematically destroyed. Between 1945 and 1946, German prisoners of war returned to a homeland that existed only in ruins. The journey home provided the ultimate education in the consequences of ideology versus the reward. Many prisoners had gained significant weight during American captivity. Hans Müller returned home 30 pounds heavier than when captured, his health improved by regular meals, medical care, and the absence of combat stress. They returned to families who had lost weight to systematic starvation while living in freedom under German rule. This physical evidence of American prosperity versus German deprivation was written on their bodies, undeniable proof that the nation they had been taught was weak and decadent possessed strength that manifested in the ability to nourish even enemies. Medical examinations conducted by Allied authorities showed that German prisoners generally returned healthier than when captured, while their families had been weakened by years of deprivation under Nazi rule. Prisoners brought home final Red Cross packages containing American chocolate, coffee, and canned goods that became family treasures. Children who had forgotten chocolate's taste received Hershey bars from fathers who had eaten ice cream regularly in prison camps, while their families subsisted on turnip soup and sawdust bread. The psychological transformation was complete and irreversible. Otto Schneider returned to find his hometown of Augsburg reduced to rubble, his family living in a bombed basement, surviving on American relief supplies. His 6-year-old daughter Maria hadn't seen chocolate since her 2nd birthday. When he gave her a Hershey bar he had saved from his final Red Cross package, she ate it slowly, making each square last as long as possible while tears streamed down his face. "Papa," she asked in her small voice, "where did the Americans get chocolate when we have none?" The question contained within it the entire failure of Nazi ideology. How could enemies possess such abundance that they could give chocolate to prisoners while German children went without? The answer challenged every assumption about racial superiority, industrial capacity, and political systems that had motivated German participation in the war. Former prisoners of war became unexpected advocates for the Marshall Plan, the American program to rebuild European economies through massive financial assistance. They had witnessed American abundance firsthand and understood that American prosperity wasn't zero-sum. It wasn't built on extracting wealth from others, but on creating wealth through productive capacity. Their testimony that Americans could afford to rebuild their enemies influenced German acceptance of American aid programs that would defend. These men understood that American power derived from productive capacity rather than conquest, from creation rather than extraction. They had observed a society wealthy enough to waste food while fighting a global war, strong enough to treat enemies with dignity, and confident enough to share abundance rather than hoard it. This mental model, prosperity through production rather than plunder, would fundamentally shape West Germany's economic approach during Reconstruction. Klaus Weber, the former tank commander, established a small importing business in Hamburg, specializing in American food products. He understood their appeal from personal experience, knowing these products represented more than taste. They symbolized abundance, democracy, and modernity. When Coca-Cola returned to West Germany in 1949, becoming a symbol of American alliance and democratic values, Klaus was among the first German distributors. "Every bottle tells a story," he explained to his son years later. "It tells the story of a society that can standardize quality across a continent, that can afford to give luxury to enemies, that measures strength not by what it can take, but by what it can create and share." The German economic miracle of the 1950s was partially built on knowledge gained in American prison camps. Former prisoners who had witnessed American production methods, distribution systems, and consumer abundance applied these lessons to German Reconstruction. They had learned that mass production could make luxuries affordable, that standardization enabled both quality and efficiency, that consumer abundance created political stability rather than weakness, and that industrial democracy could outproduce authoritarian control. These lessons, learned through Coca-Cola and ice cream rather than textbooks and lectures, shaped a generation of German business and political leaders who would guide their nation toward prosperity and democratic stability. The transformation of German prisoners of war through American food abundance created ripple effects that extended far beyond individual lives, fundamentally reshaping German society and international relations for generations. The children of former prisoners grew up hearing stories of American plenty that initially seemed fantastic, tales of unlimited sugar, ice cream served to enemies, and soft drinks available to anyone with a nickel. Stories that gained credibility as West Germany recovered, and American products became symbols of democratic ice cream available year-round, Coca-Cola that tasted identical everywhere, candy bars so common that children bought them with pocket money. These stories, initially dismissed as wartime fantasies, were validated as American companies established operations in rebuilt Germany, and abundance became reality rather than memory. By the 1960s, Wolfgang Müller worked for a German company that had partnered with American businesses to introduce supermarkets to German cities. The concept of self-service stores with vast selections of products, which his father had described from American prison camp canteens, transformed German retail culture. Former prisoners of war often became importers, distributors, and advocates for American business practices because they understood abundance as competitive advantage rather than wasteful luxury. The psychological impact extended beyond economics into cultural transformation. West German business culture absorbed lessons about consumer abundance, quality standardization, and democratic markets that former prisoners had observed firsthand. The economic miracle wasn't merely about production. It was about creating abundance for ordinary citizens, ensuring that prosperity flowed downward rather than being concentrated among elites. Today, McDonald's operates over 1,400 restaurants across Germany. Coca-Cola is as ubiquitous in Berlin as it is in Birmingham, and ice cream is so ordinary that German children take frozen desserts for granted. The transformation from scarcity to abundance, initiated in American prison camps 80 years ago, is complete. Yet, the historical lesson remains powerful. Ideological transformation through abundance rather than deprivation, kindness rather than cruelty, demonstration rather than propaganda. The story of German prisoners of war and American food abundance represents history's most unusual victory. A war won through generosity, an ideology defeated by ice cream, and hearts changed not through punishment, but through plenty. These men experienced transformation not through re-education programs or political lectures, but through the simple act of being treated with dignity and fed with abundance by enemies who could have justifiably sought revenge. They arrived in America believing in German superiority and American weakness. They departed understanding that American strength derived from productive capacity so vast it could waste resources without concern. The ice cream sundae, with its layers of excess, ice cream, syrup, whipped cream, nuts, and cherry, became a metaphor for American abundance. Each component alone exceeded German dreams. Combined, they represented impossible luxury made routine. That enemies could order seconds while German children faced hunger revealed the totality of Nazi failure and the triumph of democratic capitalism. Former prisoners often recalled specific moments of revelation decades later. The first Coca-Cola's fizz on their tongues, the first spoonful of ice cream melting in their mouths, the first bite of a Hershey bar after years of ersatz chocolate. These sensory memories carried more transformative power than any political argument, because they had literally tasted democracy and found it sweet. The transformation was complete and irreversible. Men who had marched for the Third Reich returned as apostles of abundance, carrying the revolutionary message that prosperity came from freedom rather than conquest, from creation rather than extraction, from sharing rather than hoarding. They had learned that America's secret weapon wasn't military might, but the ability to give ice cream to enemies on hot summer days. In the end, the bottles of Coca-Cola and dishes of ice cream served in American prison camps achieved what armies alone could never accomplish: the complete transformation of enemy hearts and minds. The German prisoners who couldn't believe such abundance existed became its greatest witnesses, carrying home the truth that democracy tasted like chocolate and freedom fizzed like carbonation. Their story reminds us that sometimes the greatest victories are won not through destruction but through demonstration, not through taking but through giving, not through hatred but through the simple revolutionary act of serving ice cream to enemies. The men who experienced American abundance as prisoners became freedom's most unlikely ambassadors, transformed forever by the impossible reality of Coca-Cola and ice cream in American prison camps, proving that the sweetest victories are those that change hearts rather than merely defeat armies.